might have noticed that there's more anxiety, more anger, rage, more fear, more divisiveness. It seems like all that has taken over. It seems like humanity has regressed. Would you say? Amen. Yes. That just means that we as witnesses are not immune to it and are part of it. It's easy to say, oh, those people, that person, the world, humanity has regressed. We're kind of going to hell in a handbasket, is what it feels like to a lot of people. And each of us are experiencing that in a different way. We're affected by it in a different way. But we're the ones that are here. So we're either a part of the problem or we're a part of the solution. And so we want to pay attention. It just means that we have been called to be a part of the change that we want to see happen. Because I don't know anyone on this planet, or I should say, I don't know anyone here that says, I think war is a good idea. I think being at each other's throat is a really good idea. I think being a polluter of the planet is a really good idea. But we're all a part of it because we're here. There is no separation. And so the world becomes an opportunity for us to look in the mirror and say, oh, my work is cut out for me. My spiritual practices, my spiritual work, my inner work is cut out for me because we already have the answer within. We already are the answer. Otherwise, we wouldn't notice and we wouldn't have a desire for more peace and harmony in the world. And so what is asked of us then is that we surrender to something greater, something higher, something more powerful. And we might call that God. If anybody here has a hard time with the word God, just spell it backward, dog, or call it harmony or peace. I know some of you people think your dogs are God, so it's okay to say dog. I love watching people with their pets. It's just the best. So it's important that what you call it has an emotional resonance. That you feel something when you think the word or say the word. So we talk about will, God's will, God's will. And a lot of people think God's will is something outside themselves. We know in our teaching that since God, the universe, spirit, the divine presence is within us, it created us out of itself, we know that it exists within us. So what we discover is that we have a personal will, the will of the ego, the will of our humanness, the will of our personality, and we have a higher will, which is the will of our spirit, the will of God within us, the will of the universe, the will of our soul. And the reason that so many people are confused is because they consider those two separate. There's my will and there's God's will. There's my will and then there's the universal will. We forget that they are one and they're connected. They're sort of like a quarter. You have heads and tail. Think of heads as the universe and think of tail as the personality, the ego. Our quarters are a little dull and tarnished. They need a little polishing. The polishing is really the inner work that we do, our spiritual practices, our emotional work, our mental work, our healing work. It's noticing where we feel disconnected, where we feel lack, where we feel limitation, where we find ourselves judging or complaining. Some of us have these, right? That's where we are disconnected from that higher will, from our higher self, from our true self. And it's an invitation to reconnect, to remember. And so we pay attention to the will we're experiencing. And I think we all know the difference. When I'm experiencing divine will, God's will, I'm with my hands open, like we did in the meditation. I'm more open, more receptive, more present, more in the moment, more relaxed, more surrendered, more trusting, more faith-filled. But when I'm focused on my will, I tend to be stuck in my history, or be on autopilot, on automatic. Or maybe I'm stuck in my conditioning or an old habit. Or maybe I am experiencing the unhealed part of me. Maybe I'm in my personal agenda, my way or the highway. Maybe I'm in lack of accepting that higher will. And so we use our will to be more focused. That's the only reason why we need a personal will, to stay on track, to stay focused, to know where you're going, to make the choice to listen to that higher will. Because that higher will, that universal will, that divine will, is your true nature. It is the truth principles that we study, practice, agree with. It's our wholeness. It's already who we are. It's who we will always be. It's what we have always been. But we have forgotten to pay attention to that. And that's really the problem with what we see in the world. There's that disconnect from spirit. And so it's coming back to spirit, back to our true nature, back to our inner nature, that we then find balance once again, because it is just a remembrance that they're not separate, they are one. So it requires us to do a whole lot more listening, which seems to be a quality that is dissolving or disappearing. Because we all have a lot to say, and we're all pretty loud about it, but we don't always listen. And so there's only a slight shift that we have to make. A very slight shift. I think what happens to people, they say, well, I'm a hopeless case because, fill out your favorite blank. Well, I'm a hopeless case because I haven't really done many spiritual practices, or I don't know how. That's an interesting one. You do, but you think you don't, right? I'm a hopeless case because of my past. I'm a hopeless case because of my job or because of how much money is in my bank account. We all have our excuses, don't we? Some of the ones we don't even really realize that they're excuses. But it's a very slight shift. It's that exact tipping point where the seesaw tips over to the other side. It's that very slight shift of a kaleidoscope where you only have to move it 1 millimeter and you have a whole different picture. It's a very slight shift. And it's so slight that we don't always notice because we're more identified with our will, our conditioning, our history, our problems, the problems of the world, than looking for that connection that we have with the divine that is ever present. It's like being at the center of a storm, watching the storm raging around us, but staying centered so that no matter what is going on in the world or in our world, we are standing somewhere solidly in the truth, solidly in our divine will, solidly in our spirit, solidly in our heart, so that it doesn't matter, it can keep on raging, but you know where you stand. That's been the beauty for me of watching what's happening in this country and in the world. I know it's happening, I'm aware, I listen to the news. I don't think, la 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 is the answer. Maybe for some, but not for me. So I know what's going on, and I think of one of my teachers many years ago, he said, the news is just a prayer request. It is just to see what is yours, to be a part of in shifting the consciousness. And so, instead of being caught up in the storm, it's being in that place of knowing the truth and doing whatever it takes to stay there. Whether it's a class or a spiritual practice or reading or wearing the perfect t-shirt Bridget has the best t-shirts, huh? Or being on a team, or being in service. Yes, one moment. So, heads or tails. You can't have half a quarter, so you need to pay attention to where you are and where you want to go. The spiritual path, to me, begins at the moment of that tipping point. The spiritual path is not because you have the most books, taken the most classes, although that helps, show up at all the cool workshops, wear the right clothes, whatever it is for you. The spiritual path really begins when there's a tipping point and you begin to pay more attention to God's will within you and less attention to your own will. I take yoga, and a few years ago, my yoga teacher said, the posture really begins when you want to get out of it. I was like, ooh. I said a few words. But it was so powerful, I never forget it. It made so much sense to me. It's like the spiritual path. Your spiritual path really begins when you have problems, when you're struggling, when you're witnessing something horrendous and you don't know what to do with it. When you have a challenge, that is not always true because we don't need to have challenges in order to wake up to our true nature. But that's when the spiritual path begins because that's when you know what you're made of. That's when you really know where your consciousness is. That's when you have to have faith that there's something much bigger taking place in your life that is calling you to higher ground and calling you to be a part of something really big and powerful and to lend your consciousness to that. Ernest Holmes says, we shall often need to know that the truth, capital T, which we announce is superior to the condition we are to change. Let me repeat that. We shall often need to know that the truth which we announce is superior to the condition we are to change. In other words, if we're speaking from the standpoint of spirit, then there can be no opposition to it. It is only when we let go of all human will and recognize the pure essence of the spiritual principle incarnated in us that thought rises above a belief in duality. We are all a part of what's happening in the world. The question is, what part? Don't answer it. We're all a part of what's happening in the world. The question is what part? And can we keep fine-tuning that part? Can we keep awakening to that part? Our part, because we're here, because you love this center, and you love this teaching, and you love spirituality, and you love spiritual books, and you love workshops, and you love classes, our part is to be the living spiritual principles that we are teaching and that we are learning. Pick one and live it. Pick one and live it big. Pick one and experience it inside your body if your body has an issue. In your finances, if your finances is the issue. In your relationships, if your relationships is the issue. If you don't have an issue, just hold that vision of truth really high wherever you go, whatever you're doing. And maybe challenge yourself and step into a place that's unfamiliar to you, that's painful to you. And the good news is that it's really simple. People say to me, is the teaching simple? Yeah, it's very simple. It's very simple. And it's not. Right? It's simple and it's not simple. It's simple in its theory, but the practice, sometimes. I'm not complaining. feeling, I keep saying, 18 days, I bet that I'm cheating. I must be cheating. So sometimes when I think I must be cheating, just for the fun of it, I switch it, because it's not about getting to the 21 days of no complaining. It's being conscious and being in the practice, right? And so it's simple, because the only thing we have to do is to stay aligned with the truth of our very nature that already is, always has been, always will be, and it's right where we are. Simple, right? Just do that. Do whatever you need to do to stay connected to your higher self. Do whatever you need to do to stay connected to your higher self. And if you forget, something will remind you. And just go back, start again, with kindness, compassion for self. And it's important to do it in the morning for those of you that work during the day or out in the world during the day, because it sets the tone. And when you do your morning practices, it sets the tone. I don't know if any of you have noticed where you wake up and you forgot to do your spiritual practices and you go out into the world and everything just kind of goes wrong and you kind of go, what was that? I forgot to do my spiritual practices this morning. Is almost always the answer. Not only does it set the tone for the day, but it protects you. It protects you when you go out into the world. It's like you have this glow around you that kind of bounces stuff off that doesn't really serve you anymore. And then practice turning away from the will, the self-will. Just using it as a way to stay focused and to stay on track and to keep going into the direction of the truth. And keep turning towards God's will, Spirit's will, your soul's will, your higher will. Ernest Holmes says, true prayer must be, thy will be done. But the implication relative to the will of God in this prayer is not a submission to the inevitability of evil or limitation. It is a knowledge that the will of God is always good. It is knowing that this higher will inside of us is always guiding us to the greater good. It's always freeing us. That it's something that's always flowing through us. It's always being lived, expressed, experienced. We just have to make that slight shift and turn within to it. And for some of you, that takes practice. Every morning when I wake up, I do my spiritual practices. And one of those practices is a question. Spirit, how may I serve? How may I serve today? It's actually not just one time I ask. I ask all day long, especially when I'm having a hard time with something. And I keep, my mantra is, thy will be done, not my will. And I have found that it has made my life so much easier. No matter what's going on. I get bad news, believe me. Things happen, believe me. But I know that there's something bigger taking place, and when I'm focused on that thing, instead of God's will, divine will, the truth, I have a different experience. And so it gets easier.